Hello there. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Toronto and Mimico Electric Railway. This was an interurban line that ran from Toronto to Port Credit. I did briefly look at this route in my video about the Long Branch Streetcar, so this one will be a bit more of an in-depth look. So with that, let's get into the video. The origins of the Mimico interurban begin in the late 1800s. In October of 1890, the Toronto Globe newspaper ran a featured article titled, "Toronto's Growing Suburb, New Toronto as it is and what it will be." In that article, among various illustrations and street plans, it would be stated, "On the borders of the city there is an embryo town growing up which promises in time to equal, if not surpass, Old Toronto as a commercial center." As part of this development, developers promised prospective residents that the area would be served by an electric railway to connect them to the city by the summer of 1891. The Toronto Globe would report, "The intention is to have a service to Shoals Hotel at the termination of the High Park route of the Toronto Street Railway. An effort will be made to secure a transfer system between the electric cars and all routes crossing Queen Street. 4 electric cars are expected to give 10-minute service to New Toronto from Shoals Hotel." For those wondering, the Shoals Hotel building still exists and is located at the King, Queen, and Roncesvalles intersection. Today, it's a mixed-use building. On November 19th, the Toronto and Mimico Electric Railway and Light Company, TNMER, would be incorporated to operate this service to New Toronto. The company would be led by Barlow Cumberland, who prior to this was an author. On December 23rd, the TNMER would receive approval from York County for the construction of the railway along Lakeshore and was granted a 21-year operating franchise. 1 month later, in January of 1891, the Etobicoke Township would pass a similar law. The provincial government would pass legislation allowing for the expropriation of land for the right-of-way and stations. As well, it also allowed for the TNMER to extend its service east to Dufferin Street within the city of Toronto. The Mimico line would be built to the streetcar gauge of 4 feet 10 and 7/8 inches. While all the legal hurdles had been passed with little issue, construction of the line itself wouldn't begin until August of 1891, well past when New Toronto had expected the railway to reach the village. Construction would take a year and the Mimico line wouldn't officially begin service until July 16, 1892. What's worse is when the route opened, it only went as far as the Humber River, leaving the villages of Mimico and New Toronto without their promised interurban. The route would run on the north side of Lakeshore Boulevard on a single track between Roncesvalles Avenue and the Humber River, with additional stops probably around Sunnyside Beach, High Park, and Swansea. I say probably because I couldn't find out exactly what was happening on this section of the route. Cars for the route were apparently stored in a shed near Grenadier Pond, although I couldn't find the exact location. The route would be popular in the summer with picnickers, beachgoers, and sightseers, as this route offered an easy way to places like Sunnyside Beach and High Park. The TNMER would run 2 open double-deck cars on the line, which was great for sightseers. However, this success was seasonal, as when the summer ended, ridership quickly dried up. This was due to both the fact that the route really didn't serve anything besides a beach and another entrance into High Park, 2 things which have a seasonal passenger draw. However, another issue was the route used open cars, that is, cars with no walls. And while this is great for warm weather sightseeing, it is awful for service in the winter. A major blow would be dealt to the TNMER when a breakdown occurred at the line's powerhouse, causing service on the route to be suspended. The TNMER was already out of money and needed help. Facing financial troubles, the TNMER would be bailed out by Sir William Mackenzie. While I won't go into too much detail about him as I already did in my video on the Metropolitan Railway, by this point in time, Sir William Mackenzie was the owner of the Toronto Railway Company, which had been operating Toronto's streetcar network since 1891. By the summer of 1893, Mackenzie's influence on the Mimico line was being felt as the route had been rebuilt to better standards. As well, a western extension of the route to the Mimico Creek was being constructed. Mackenzie would move 2 cars from his Toronto Railway Company over to the Mimico line to operate the service. These were old horse-drawn cars that had been modernized with electric motors and trolley poles. More importantly, however, it was that these cars actually had walls, so they could be used in the winter. Service on the Mimico line would restart on July 1st, running its pre-existing route from Roncesvalles to the Humber River. 4 days later, on July 5th, the T&MER would be formally purchased by the Toronto Railway Company. 5 days after that, on July 10th, the western extension to the Mimico Creek would open. This would see the Mimico line extended 1.5 kilometers west across the Humber River on the north side of Lakeshore Boulevard. Additional stops would be located at Queen Street, Hicks, Brown, and Johnson. Expansion of the Mimico line would come rapidly as only 2 months later the route would be extended to Kipling Avenue in the village of New Toronto, a full 2 years after the village had hoped. This extension would see the route extended 4.4 kilometers from the Mimico Creek through the village of Mimico to Kipling Avenue in the village of New Toronto. Additional stops would be located at Louisa Street, Burlington Street, Albert Avenue, Superior Avenue, Mimico Avenue, Summerhill Road, Mimico Switch, Simon Street, Hendry's, Church Street, Dwight Avenue, 3rd and 4th Streets, 5th and 6th Streets, 7th and 8th Streets, and Asylum. The route would also include passing loops at Park Lawn Road, Allen Avenue, and Royal York Road, which was called Church Street at the time. Looking at the stop spacing, you can tell this route wasn't just a mere interurban ferrying people into and out of Toronto. This route also functioned as a local streetcar service for the villages of Mimico and New Toronto. A year later, on July 1st, 1895, the Mimico line would receive yet another extension, this time a 2-kilometer extension to Brown's line in the village of Long Branch. Additional stops would be located at 22nd Street, Lilac Avenue, Violet Avenue, Long Branch Park, and Loons. Service along the Mimico line was once every 20 minutes and every 30 minutes during the evening. A single fare to Long Branch was 15 cents and 20 cents for a return trip. Alongside its normal cars, the T&MER would also deploy 2 open double truck cars on the route, each being able to carry 96 passengers. These were the largest cars ever used on a Toronto interurban and were popular during the summer for cottagegoers and people heading to the many resorts along this stretch of Lake Ontario. The T&MER would have an impact on the areas it passed through, as up until this point this section of Lakeshore west of the city was what we would call cottage country, if you can believe it. The area was dotted with small and modest cottages as well as large summer estates for the more affluent of the city. There wasn't really much in the way of permanent residence in the area. However, the interurban would bring development with it, and stores and homes would begin to cluster around the car stops. Eventually, the whole of Lakeshore from the Mimico Creek to Long Branch was lined on either side by places to shop and live. Historian Frank Langstaff would state, "The radial streetcar was the catalyst for urban development along Lakeshore. Electric, not steam locomotion provided the rapid, facile, frequent transit necessary to ensure the movement of city workers to the new suburban factories and at the same time new suburban commuters to city jobs." The once sleepy villages of Mimico, New Toronto, and Long Branch were to become the new streetcar suburbs and in time small towns in their own right. However, things like this take time, and it wouldn't be until the 1900s that the Mimico line would begin to see year-round passenger traffic. Still, change was occurring and the interurban was the catalyst for it. In the meantime, the T&MER would continue to lean on its summer popularity as residents of Toronto used it to access Long Branch Park, which had over the years evolved into a large pleasure park featuring picnic areas, swimming and boating facilities, and an amusement park. On June 13, 1897, the T&MER would begin running Sunday service on the Mimico line. As development along Lakeshore continued, the T&MER would finally begin to turn a profit. In 1902, the T&MER would turn a profit of $9,681 and carry 482,042 passengers. In 1903, the province would pass legislation allowing the T&MER to extend its service to a point in or near the city of Hamilton, connect with other railways, and change its track gauge to standard gauge if they wished. That same year, the T&MER would change its name to simply the Toronto and Mimico Railway, or T&MR. In 1904, the T&MR would request permission from the City of Toronto to connect its tracks to the Toronto streetcar tracks, allowing for a through service to be operated directly into downtown. The city would reject this request as their feud with Sir William Mackenzie had kicked off and no Mackenzie-owned interurban was going to be allowed near downtown. Once again, see my video on the Metropolitan Railway to find out what was going on. On August 1, 1904, Sir William Mackenzie would establish the Toronto and York Radial Railway, and the T&MR would be folded into the Toronto and York, becoming the Mimico division. Seeing no future to the east, the Toronto and York would look west for further expansion options for the Mimico line, and there they would find the Hamilton Radial Electric Railway. The two companies would come to an agreement, with both of them extending their routes into Oakville, where they would connect, forming a single continuous route from Hamilton to Toronto. Each company would have through running rights on each other's lines, and it seemed soon one would be able to ride an interurban all the way from downtown Hamilton and maybe one day Niagara Falls to Toronto, although not quite downtown. Both companies would begin construction on their respective extensions, although only the Hamilton line would ever reach Oakville. The T&YRR would begin construction on its western extension to Oakville, although it would immediately encounter resistance. The Eastwood family owned the land on the west side of the Etobicoke Creek and would not allow the interurban to cross through. This ordeal would go on through the spring and half of the summer of 1905, with the company executive Charles Wilson stating, "Mr. Eastwood sat on his property with a shotgun and promised to shoot anybody who trespassed. It required considerable tact and diplomacy to persuade Eastwood to finally allow the crossing." The Mimico line would begin service to Hurontario Street on December 24, 1905. This extension would be 5.3 kilometers long and see the tracks cut across Lakeshore and run along the south side of the street into the village of Port Credit. Additional stops were located at Halliday's, St. Andrews Road, Walsh, Hague Boulevard, Aviation Camp, Rifle Ranges, Lakeview School, Aviation Road, Canterbury, Winona, and Briarwood Avenue. 1 year later, the Mimico line would receive its final extension, with the route being extended 490 meters to Stave Bank Road. The T&YRR had surveyed the rest of the route to Oakville, but this further western extension would never come. A trip on the Mimico and TTC streetcar from Stave Bank Road to Yonge Street was 18 cents, and it was estimated to take 2 hours. Life for the Mimico line would be pretty uneventful through the 1900s and 1910s. While the city and the Toronto and York fought over Yonge Street, the Mimico continued to trundle along with ridership growing. That said, the proposed extension to Oakville was dead in the water, and it was clear by this point that there would be no through service into downtown Toronto. If the 1900s and 1910s were quiet, then the 20s would be anything but. On August 16, 1922, the Toronto and York would be purchased by the City of Toronto and with it the Mimico line. As part of this purchase, ownership and financing of the route would transfer to the city, with its operations being contracted out to the Ontario Hydroelectric Railway on November 1st. As well, the portion of the route within Toronto's boundaries would be given to the TTC. Specifically, service on the Mimico line would be cut back in the east to the new Humber Loop at the Humber River. Service east of it to Roncesvalles Avenue would now be part of the TTC's King Streetcar. Upon taking control of the Mimico line, Ontario Hydro would set out to improve service on the line. This included re-gauging the route to standard gauge, the introduction of new passenger cars built by the Ottawa Car Company, and lastly, doubling frequency on the line. Then chairman of the Ontario Hydroelectric Commission, Sir Adam Beck, had a grand vision for a 4 to 6 track wide right-of-way along Toronto's waterfront. The Mimico line would use this high-speed route to access downtown Toronto. This was all part of his wider effort to create a large integrated interurban network around southern Ontario. On January 6, 1925, he would speak in the village of Mimico, where he would decry Toronto's lack of a feasible, adequate, or common sense scheme of railway transportation as it affects the outlying districts. He had hoped that the municipalities along Lakeshore would buy in on the idea and pressure Toronto into allowing for the high-speed route to be built to at least Bathurst Street. The municipalities along Lakeshore, however, shunned financial responsibility for the proposal, and it ultimately went nowhere. Ridership on the Mimico line had been dropping, with a ridership of 3,760,299 in 1923 down to 2,325,701 in 1926. The reason for this lay largely with the nearby CN rail line, today's GO Lakeshore West line, which paralleled the interurban for its entirety. Residents along the route were opting to take the train into Toronto instead, as unlike the Mimico line, the CN line went to Union Station in downtown Toronto. As well, the train took half the time to get there at half the price. By 1926, a train ride from Port Credit to Union Station took 32 to 34 minutes and cost 22 cents. That's $3.91 today. Psst, that's actually cheaper than the GO train today. Nearly half the price, in fact. By comparison, the fare for a trip on the Mimico line and the Toronto streetcar into downtown Toronto would set riders back 44 cents, $7.81, and take between 50 minutes to an hour. By the mid-1920s, the Ontario Hydro lines were losing money due to increased competition from cars, buses, and in the case of the Mimico line, the steam railway. On January 12, 1927, the City of Toronto would end its operations agreement with Ontario Hydro and hand over the city's interurbans to the TTC. The TTC would first re-gauge the route back to streetcar gauge, 4 feet 10 and 7/8 inches, to make it compatible with the city's streetcar network. 11 months later, on November 21st, service on the Mimico line would be extended back to Roncesvalles Avenue. As well, storage and maintenance of Mimico cars would now be handled at Roncesvalles Car House, with the old shed at Grenadier Pond being torn down. The TTC would formally end service on the Mimico Interurban on September 28, 1928. Over the next 2 months, the TTC would rip up the old worn-down interurban tracks and replace them, double-tracking the line to the new Long Branch Loop in the process. The former route west of Long Branch Loop would remain single-track though. On December 8th, streetcars would once again trundle down Lakeshore, although now as the Lakeshore Streetcar, running from Long Branch Loop to Church Street in downtown Toronto. The residents of Long Branch, New Toronto, and Mimico finally had their one-seat streetcar ride into the city. While the Mimico line as it was known was now effectively dead, a small portion of it did live on a little longer in a vestigial form west of Long Branch, specifically in the Port Credit streetcar. As mentioned earlier, the route west of Long Branch Loop remained as a single-track line, although the tracks were upgraded. The Port Credit streetcar would operate from Long Branch Loop to Stave Bank Road using the old Mimico passenger cars. Service on the route was once every half hour and operated 24 hours a day. Service on the Port Credit streetcar, however, would end on February 9, 1935, and its tracks soon torn up. The Mimico Interurban was officially dead, ending 43 years of service. Okay, but is it really dead? I mean, sure, we don't call it the Mimico line anymore, but the route is still largely intact. Today, the streetcar tracks along Lakeshore Boulevard from Long Branch Loop to Humber Loop follow the exact route the Mimico line did. So ultimately, the communities along the former route lost nothing really, which makes them lucky compared to other parts of Toronto and the Greater Toronto Area, which once had streetcar and/or interurban service but don't anymore. Of course, it's not as if everyone got off easy, as the areas of Lakeview and Port Credit did lose streetcar service, and it's hard to say if it will ever return. That said, of Toronto's interurbans, the Mimico line is the most intact, as nearly the entire route still exists, save for the west end of the route to Port Credit and its original alignment to Roncesvalles Avenue. This is in comparison to all the other former interurban lines, to which almost nothing remains today. All that said, does anything else of the Mimico line still exist beyond the route itself? The answer to that is yes. Specifically, car 416 is preserved at the Halton County Radial Railway Museum. This car was originally used on the Mimico line but was transferred to the North Yonge Railway in the 1930s. It also goes without saying that nearly everything along Lakeshore within the old towns of Long Branch, New Toronto, and Mimico exists because of the Mimico line. The Mimico line played a pivotal role in developing these municipalities, changing them from far-flung cottage areas into streetcar suburbs. This route ran along a street that was once lined with nothing but cottages, estates, and nothing, but is now lined with shops and homes on either side. Factories and other such industrial buildings would pop up in these communities, aided by the interurban's ability to bring people to and from work. Ultimately, the Mimico line is not gone, and it's certainly not dead. It just got a new identity. Today, it lives on in the 501 Queen, 507 Long Branch, and 508 Lakeshore streetcars that continue to serve the communities it built. And with that, I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please hit that subscribe button because there are more videos like it on the channel, and there are more videos like it on the way. If there's anything you want to say about the Mimico Interurban, don't be afraid to do so in the comments section down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.